Lantern Control is a slow, grindy, prison-style control deck that aims to use artifacts to lock your opponent out from being able to do anything. It has a very unique style of play. What it aims to do is to survive the early game and to lock your opponent out. It then wants to control the mid to late game by controlling what your opponent draws. If you can do this, you are essentially fate-sealing your opponent for the rest of the game, controlling and manipulating what cards they draw so that they never draw anything relevant and so they basically never get to play Magic. You grind out the game long enough that you either mill your opponent for the win or you ping them to death using Pyrite Spellbomb, taking them down to 0 life. No one likes to play against Lantern Control. Expect to lose some friends. So then, let's start out with the enchantments and artifacts that Lantern Control plays. It runs 4 Lantern of Insight, which is where the name of the deck comes from. This is so that you can see what card your opponent is about to draw. If the card on top looks unimposing, you can let your opponent draw it. But if you don't like it, you can use one of your milling effects so that your opponent doesn't get to draw it. It lets you control your opponent's draw step, effectively locking them out from being able to draw anything relevant to play. Plus, in a pinch, you can sacrifice the Lantern to get your opponent to shuffle if you really don't want them to draw the card on top, but you don't have any milling effects left. It runs 4 Codex Shredder. Use this in conjunction with Lantern of Insight to pick what your opponent draws by milling the cards on top that you don't like. You will very rarely use the other ability on Codex Shredder. The point of the Codex Shredders is so that you have a cheap recurring way to mill the top card of your opponent. It runs 4 Ghoul Caller's Bell, another cheap artifact that lets you mill the top card of your opponent's library. Plus it runs 3 to 4 Mox Opal. Now because you're running so many artifacts, you'll get Metalcraft very easily, and then you can use this mana acceleration to dump your hand very fast, which is very important for the next card on the list. Ensnaring Bridge. This cheap little artifact will oftentimes make your opponent's creatures entirely irrelevant because they won't be able to attack you. And because your artifacts are so cheap, you'll often have dumped your hand by turn 3 or even turn 2. And just in case your opponent has another angle to win from, like a Planeswalker, it runs 3 Pithing Needle in the main. Yes, in the main. Now remember, you can always name fetch lands with Pithing Needle. Plus it runs 3 copies of Spellskite to protect your other artifacts from removal. And just to ensure that you have another win condition outside of milling, it runs 2 Pyrite Spell Bombs in the main. Sack it to deal 2 damage to your opponent. You can then use Academy Ruins to put it back on the top of your library so that you can draw it again next turn to do another 2 damage to your opponent. As you can see, this is a very slow, grindy death that can take up to 10 turns to kill your opponent. You only run 2 of it because thanks to Academy Ruins, you get to continuously recur it, so you only ever need to draw it once. And because you're going to be spending so much time locking out your opponent anyway, you're not going to need to be playing it for quite some time. And sometimes, as an alternate win condition, it will run a single copy of Gaia Per Ethergrid. I probably pronounced that wrong, to be honest with you. I've had lots of people tell me different ways to pronounce that, so again, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. The great thing about this is it is a less mana intensive win condition, which means that you will close out your games faster. Those are the artifacts and enchantments that it runs. Let's move on to the instants and sorceries. It runs 3 Gitaxian Probe. This lets you get information on your opponent's hand for free while cantripping itself for the very low cost of 2 life. Having information on your opponent's hand is extremely valuable because it lets you sequence your plays correctly, plus it can lead to some absolute blowouts, like using Pithing Needle to name the only fetch land in your opponent's hand. It runs 2 to 4 copies of Inquisition of Kozilek. This is painless targeted discard that hits most relevant things in Modern. The purpose of this card is to disrupt your opponent's early game plan while of course giving you information on their hand so that you can sequence your plays correctly. Lantern Control is most vulnerable in the early game before it has been able to assemble a lock using its artifacts, so you need to use your targeted discard to be able to survive the early game. Because the goal of your discard is to survive the early game, Inquisition of Kozilek is normally the base discard spell that Lantern players go towards because it will hit almost everything, since you will very rarely want to be taking a card with converted mana cost of 4 or more, and because it is painless, this helps you survive the early game even more. It runs 0 to 2 copies of Duress. Because of the fact that Lantern Control has Ensnaring Bridge, it is normally more concerned with non-creature cards that will disrupt its game plan, like Abrupt Decay. And it runs 0 to 3 copies of Thoughtseize. It costs 2 life, but you have more flexibility in the types of cards that you are able to take. And it runs 4 Ancient Stirrings. This lets you dig early on for artifacts that you need. It runs between 0 to 2 copies of Infernal Tutor. Because the cards in your hand are so cheap, it means that you can dump them so quickly, and so very quickly Infernal Tutor can come online. It runs 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. Because of the fact that you're milling your opponent so much, it means you can very effectively use it at instant speed to take away very annoying cards from your opponent's library. And it runs 2 Abrupt Decay. This is great against most of your opponent's very scary cards, plus it's very good against most of the hate that's going to be aimed towards you, such as Kataki's War Wage or Stony Silence, which would make your artifacts basically near useless. And those there are the instants and sorceries. Let's move on to the land base. Lantern Control will normally run just 17 lands. Lantern Control, despite the fact that it is mostly just colorless artifacts, is actually 4 colors. It is blue, black, red, and green. Because of this, the mana base is surprisingly expensive, which removes it from being a budget deck in Modern. But let's be honest, Lantern Control has hardly been a main player at GPs and the like. That means then that there isn't exactly a very tested mana base, and there is quite a lot of variation, so feel free to play around with this mana base and see what you like best. It runs 4 Glimmer Void. Because you have so many artifacts, you have tons of way to turn this online, and it is a painless way for you to be able to play any color. This is a standout land in the list. It runs 4 Llanowar Wastes to give you access to your primary colors, which are black and green. It runs 2 Black Cleave Cliffs. It runs 2 Copperline Gorge. And it runs 1 copy of Tendo Icebridge. You might be thinking, why would I use this because I only get to use its colored mana once? Well, the reason is you don't actually have that many colored spells anyway, so usually you won't be sad that you'll only get to use it once in the game. And the upsides are huge. You like that it's painless because of the fact that in the early game you're just trying to survive. Plus, it can come into play untapped. The list also runs 2 copies of Ghost Quarter to disrupt your opponent's land base. And of course, you have 2 copies of Academy Ruins for your amazing Pyrite Spellbomb win condition. Just like Pyrite Spellbomb, you only run 2 copies. This is because you don't need to draw it early on, because early on you're just focusing on locking your opponent out using your prison pieces and stopping them from being able to play magic. You only need this later on in the game. And that there is your main board. Let's move on to your sideboard options. Pyroclasm is often played to be able to wipe the board when you're facing aggressive strategies. Sun Droplet helps deal with creatures that are small and just get under Ensnaring Bridge, plus it also helps against burn. Welding Jar protects your important artifacts from removal. Nature's Claim is cheap, efficient removal that is brought in against key hate cards that are often sided in against you, such as Leyline of Sanctity and Stony Silence. Plus, it's great against strategies that are using artifacts anyway, such as Amulet of Vigor or Affinity. Seal of Primordium is often played as a second version, basically, of Nature's Claim. Now, this has 2 advantages. Firstly, you can still play it if your opponent tries to lock you out with a Chalice for 1, which can be very devastating. So you can play this and then get rid of the Chalice. The next reason why you might want to play this card is because it means then that you get to play it in anticipation for problematic enchantments or artifacts that you're going to be facing, which means that you can dump your hand for Ensnaring Bridge. Gravedigger's Cage is a very cheap answer to lots of problematic strategies and cards in Modern, such as Snipcaster Mage and Court of Cooling. Null Spellbomb lets you fight against graveyard strategies while cantripping itself. And sometimes it will run additional discard, again, like Inquisition of Kozilek, Thoughtseize, or Duress, and this is, again, usually used to help you fight against the early game. And that there is Lantern Control. Now remember to play fast. This is a very grindy, notoriously slow deck that is often known for going 2 time, so you need to practice it and get very quick with your plays if you want to be cruel enough to bring it to your local tournament. If you like this video, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Magic Together in Kiwi. Or alternatively, if you're watching it on Facebook, I'd really appreciate it if you like the video, like the page, and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching. Have fun making enemies with Lantern Control.